Alrighty. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is a collaboration between Prospiant Greenhouses and OneCanopy. And today's topic is reforestation, the challenges and opportunities for greenhouse growers associated with it. Today's hosts are, my name is Mark Rich. I am an outside sales rep and system engineer for Prospiant in the commercial growing division of our business. I've been with the company for roughly 8 years. I have a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering and then a master's in business administration. And then, Paul, I'll let you introduce yourself and then move on to Katelynn.
Sounds good. My name is Paul Golden. I'm the Director of Commercial Sales for Prospiant. Been with the organization since the Nexus days, about 11, 12 years now. With the organization, came from the greenhouse industry. Prior to that, my background's in engineering and physics. And I'll go ahead and let Katelynn introduce herself.
Yeah, my name is Katelynn Martinez. I'm president and founding partner at OneCanopy. We're a native plant nursery located in Loveland, Colorado. We're fairly new to the scene. We started OneCanopy about 5 years ago. Prior to the nursery industry, I worked in the state and federal government, mostly in forest health. My background is in forest management, and then I also hold an MBA in corporate sustainability, both from Colorado State University.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. And FYI, if any of the viewers have any questions, there is a question box over on the right side. So please feel free to put any and all questions in there, and we will answer them as they come through. But moving on, the agenda of today's meeting is all focused around reforestation and native plants and how things work. And we're going to start by talking about the big picture of everything, transition a little bit more into the native plants and the biodiversity applications that come with that. We're going to talk about the challenges involved in both sides of that business, talk about some different systems that we can implement, types of structures we can implement to help with the growing side of things. And then we're going to kind of round it out with talking about tree seedlings in the greenhouse and the different stages of everything along there. So moving into the meat of the presentation, kind of talking the big picture. And I'm going to kind of pass this to Katelynn over here and just talk about, Katelynn, what is Reforestation U and what does it look like? What do you think of?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about reforestation at OneCanopy, what we're really talking about is more so restoration. And I think most folks who serve this niche of native plants for restoration think of it a little bit more holistic than reforestation, right? Reforestation is mostly just planting trees, but really we're talking about all sorts of different ecosystems. So that could be forested ecosystems, wetland ecosystems, even the prairie, or in the West, the sagebrush steppe ecosystem is a pretty common one in need of restoration. And so kind of the whole gamut of ecosystems, really. And again, with that comes a wide variety of plants. So that's everything from conifers to deciduous trees to native shrubs, grasses, and forbs as well. As far as why we need restoration and why this is important, I think those of you who are on the call today, maybe living in the Western United States, understand the reason that we need reforestation and restoration. Colorado and Utah in particular right now are pretty heated. We've got a lot of active wildfires going on. Canada is also feeling the burn right now, unfortunately, as well as Minnesota. And so when we have these large-scale catastrophic wildfires, degrading our natural resources, we start to see long-term impacts to our food systems, our water, our availability to water, especially here in the Western United States. And it can really have trickle-down effects for our local economies and really just how we function as a society. In addition to fires, we're also seeing broadly an increase in disease and insect activity in our native ecosystems. And then again, this is really just because we're starting to see changes in weather patterns that allow these insects and disease to really take off and expand their life cycles. And then, of course, humans have played a role in all of this, right? Whether it's through development or just other ways in which we've impacted the ecosystem, we are undeniably changing our ecosystems, and in some ways that's having a pretty detrimental impact. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the challenges. I'll get into what stops us from doing reforestation or restoration, or kind of what slows the process. as well as who are kind of the main players in the native plant nursery and how do they operate. And then we'll talk about kind of our clientele as well.
Awesome. And we do actually have our first question that has come through from Sid is how big of a market is there for reforestation with all the wildfires that have been happening in North America the last few years and the government's lack of forest management?
Yeah, great question. So a really hard number to truly quantify. And as we all know, a market is only as big as the people who are actively buying and purchasing. And there's a lot of bureaucracies and red tape that go into implementing reforestation and restoration. If we're just looking at it in terms of acres impacted, I can speak to Colorado specifically. And that's, if we're thinking about just trees, we're thinking about the order of about 3 billion trees needed in the state of Colorado. Obviously, that number gets into double-digit billions when we're thinking about the entire span of the United States. When we started OneCanopy, the U.S. Forest Service and the Nature Conservancy released an article that you all could Google called Challenges in the Reforestation Pipeline. And the summation of this article was that even if we were to ramp up all existing native plant nurseries to full capacity, we were only going to reach 25% of the demand for native plants in the United States. So I think it's safe to say that there's plenty of demand. It's just a matter of working around all the nuance to get those trees in the ground.
Yeah. And another thing I think that we will touch on later too is the timeline associated with it. It's
Absolutely.
even if there's 100,000 acres on fire in Colorado right now, it's not as easy as just replanting those this winter or anything like that. There's timelines with it all, which we will get into a little bit later. And I'm going to pass to the next slide here where we're kind of talking about native plants and the applications of it all.
Absolutely. So when we're thinking about native plants and why native plants are so important for restoration, we also need to kind of quantify what native means. So for most native plant nurseries, native is not only a genus species designation, but it's also a genetic designation. So most folks who operate in the native plant space are looking for seed that has been collected from the region in which they're hoping to restore or reforest. And so the reason that might be important, really, the name of the game when it comes to restoration and reforestation is diversity, not only in the type of species that you're adding to a landscape or restoring in a landscape, but also the genetic diversity. So a lot of what we do in the native plant space is grow from seed rather than growing from cuttings. Softwood and hardwood cuttings are still fairly common in the restoration space, but we really are focused on making sure that we're adding genetic diversity back to the ecosystem. One, diversity helps us to create ecosystems that are resilient and resistant to insect and disease or fire issues in the future. But it also, it helps to, by collecting wild seed, essentially what we're doing is we're making sure that we've collected those genetics that have already proved to be resilient in those ecosystems to some extent. So that's kind of what we're focused on there. And again, why are forests in particular so important? The Western United States, we're based out of Colorado. So I think about this in terms of Colorado often, but, Colorado essentially provides water to most of the Western United States and some of the states east of us too, towards the Mississippi. And when we're thinking about this, when we're restoring our forests, these forests, have a direct impact on water quality. They have a direct impact on our agricultural systems in the area, as well as our air quality, with many trickle-down effects. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, how native plant ecosystems help to support pollinator life as well as wildlife, which not only adds to, my personal appreciation of our native ecosystems, right? There's kind of this like aesthetic or existential value to these systems, but our lives also depend on these animals. So it's important that we're providing habitat for them to flourish as well.
And then moving on to the next one, we kind of have a quick graphic here, kind of talking a little bit more about the timeline, going back to Sid's question. Katelynn, you want to take this one, or you want me to kind of run through some of it?
I can talk to it a little bit too. When we're thinking about, Sid, to your question, the timeline of reforestation, I can set it out, in really clean numbers like what are on this slide. So when we're thinking of stratification with native seeds, stratification can be anywhere from, we have some seeds and some species that we're able to direct sow, and others that require, anywhere from 6 to 8 months in stratification in order for us to induce germination. And of course, we're working with wild collected seeds. Oftentimes these seeds aren't, we have books and protocols to follow that tell us how a certain species may prefer to be stratified to induce germination. But of course, evolution has different plans. And so when we're collecting wild seed, that varies from seed lot to seed lot and is really kind of the crux of a native plant nursery. Native plant nurseries, where they are sourcing their seed and how they're stratifying their seed is basically the proprietary information for that nursery and takes a lot of I call it mad scientisting or like trial and error to figure out what works for each seed lot. Once we've cracked the code on stratification for a species or a seed lot, then of course we wait for germination. So most native plant nurseries, if they're cracking seed, have a germination greenhouse. Of course, that's a completely environmentally controlled greenhouse. And then once germination has happened and we've had slightly more established seedlings, we also start to harden off seedlings. And the goal is to get seedlings to be about a height of 8 to 10 inches before they leave our property. So in the industry, we would call that a plug. And that plug is really, a finished product for us. And if we're thinking about restoration or reforestation, that's what's going to be going into the ground, right? And we want to plant these smaller plants simply because they're easier to carry. So most of the outplanting that happens with restoration projects is all done by hand. There are certain parts of the United States where we're able to use machines, but by and large in the Western United States or even some of Appalachia where we're having steep slopes or really hard granite soils and rocky soils, we're doing most of this by hand. So it's important that we're able to kind of be able to carry these seedlings with us to do the planting. Anything I missed on that, Mark?
I'm kind of curious if you were to bring in like thinking mostly around the success rates of stratifying and germinating seeds. If you were to say have 1,000 seeds that you brought in, is it pretty common to get 900 to 1,000 of those to germinate, or what is the success rate on that?
I think it depends on how often we've worked with that species in particular and how much that species is being impacted in the wild and where it was collected. So I would say by and large, when it comes to germination, we're hitting anywhere from, depending on the seed lot, 90% to 98% germination. So you are getting good germination, but still, if we get 90% germination, there's been times when we've only had 80 or even 60% germination. As a nursery, we're having to figure out the logistics around that, right? You want to be able to consolidate your material or make sure that you improve that germination rate the best you can so that you're not wasting bench space.
Mm-hmm. And then collecting the seeds themselves, is that something that OneCanopy is going out and collecting the seeds, or is that a third-party company, almost it's completely its own inside of the industry that's going out and collecting seed?
Absolutely. So if anybody is interested in seed and native seed collection, we could probably have a whole nother talk about the seed pipeline. It's pretty extensive and there's quite a bit of technical knowledge that goes into this. There's a lot of native plant nurseries who do their own seed collection. OneCanopy does a very small amount of our own seed collection, but essentially most of this work of native seed collection is being done by small private seed collectors, kind of sprinkled throughout the United States. In the Rocky Mountain region, we sadly don't have very many. It's, I went to forestry school and learned a little bit about reforestation before I started my career in it, but I never learned about seed. And so I do think that most people, this isn't something that they have ever heard of being a problem or even considered that seed might be a difficult part of this pipeline. But it is I would say for me in a native plant nursery, the thing that keeps me up at night, just because we have so few people collecting wild seed and also cleaning and storing wild seed. And most of the folks who are operating in this space are later on in their careers and looking to retire. And I do fear what will happen, once their knowledge leaves the industry if we don't have young or early career folks kind of stepping up to take their place.
Yeah, and I think that speaks a lot to Sid's question earlier, is even though we are focusing today on the young plant reforestation and restoration side, the industry as a whole, you have seed collectors, you have planters, it's as an industry, there's multiple branches, and even just breaking it out into those three is still pretty vague. There's multiple branches that all of this can go into.
Absolutely. And lots of, like I said, when we are thinking about managing these landscapes that have been impacted by a catastrophic wildfire, those wildfires aren't being cognizant of any sort of jurisdictional boundary, right? A wildfire is not going to stop at when federal land ends or when a private boundary is established. And so to complicate this whole issue, we also have different jurisdictions and different players who own land that have their own set of rules and guidelines in order to accomplish these restoration and reforestation goals.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm going to head to our next slide here, talking about the reforestation itself. So, Katelynn, I know I'm letting you talk a lot, but it's awesome.
No.
I'll let you continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're thinking about reforestation and restoration, it's really critical to think about it kind of on a regional scale. So like I said, I'm based in the Rocky Mountain region. And so a lot of my perspective and lens is focused from this Rocky Mountain perspective where we're, arid, hot, dry, high elevation. All of these things impact how seedlings grow and how successful restoration is. I would argue that the Rocky Mountain region, aside from maybe the southwestern United States, is one of the most difficult regions in the United States to get plants to establish, because anybody who's in the nursery industry or a plant person knows that plants love water and we don't have a lot of it. So that's a challenge for us in the Rockies. Not to say that there aren't challenges in other parts of the United States. So the Western United States and the Pacific Northwest face their own challenges. Their nurseries in particular have to deal with a lot more fungal and bacterial issues in their greenhouses than we do here in the Rocky Mountain region. They also have quite a bit more of ungulate predation, so deer, moose, elk predation when they're outplanting some of these species. Appalachia has their own set of issues as well, just as far as number of nurseries that are out there, labor workforce, those sorts of things. And then, of course, there's a global demand for reforestation, which looks different everywhere. We're fortunate in the United States that yes, we may have some bureaucratic red tape when it comes to working with our federal or state entities to accomplish restoration, but by and large, we don't have, and comparatively, we don't have a lot of bribery in our government system, which is something that reforestation entities in other parts of the world, like Indonesia, different parts of Africa and South America, have to deal with. So not always something that you think of with reforestation, but certainly a consideration. And then, of course, we all face key constraints. And I think for the most part, these key constraints are constraints that are global constraints. So like everyone says, money is always the key, right? And for a while, we were we had more money in the reforestation space than we had before, kind of during the Biden administration. There were some pieces of legislation that went through that really earmarked money for restoration work. By and large, that money has been used and implemented, which is great, but we don't have that pool of money as much anymore. And so that is certainly a key constraint, as well as seed availability, like I talked about earlier. So just making sure that we have the people to collect the seed, that we're collecting seed at appropriate times. When we're thinking about conifer seed, for example, conifers typically don't produce seed on a regular schedule, right? There's a lot of grasses and forbs out there that produce seed every single year. conifers like to produce seed every 4 to 6 years typically. And it's not always a dependable 4 to 6 years per individual plant. And so collecting seed is complicated by that, not to mention that seed in conifers is ripens on trees over many months. And so over the course of those many months, you're hoping that none of the critters get to them before you do, because a lot of the animals consider that, you know, a primary food source in the forest. And then lastly, if we're thinking about collecting the most viable and genetically diverse seed from a conifer seed, we're having to climb those trees in order to collect that seed. There are other methods of doing it, but climbing is seen as, you know, kind of the best way to get the best genetics. And we actually have a limited, you know, labor force as far as climbing trees for that purpose is concerned. There's a little bit of a technical component when evaluating that seed while you're in the tree too, that plays a role in who's qualified or maybe not quite qualified to do that. I will say that there's lots of programs across the United States that are building seed capacity in some way or form, whether that's training people to climb trees, or even training people how to identify forb and grass seeds on the ground. So lots of work going into this, but certainly something I think that keeps most of us in the native plant industry up at night. And then nursery capacity. You know, the whole reason that OneCanopy is here and a lot of other nurseries have come online, like I said earlier, that initial research paper said that we would only reach 25% of the demand if all existing native plant nurseries were online and kind of focused on this particular effort. And so I would say, you know, for the next couple decades, we're probably still going to be struggling in terms of nursery capacity for restoration and reforestation needs. And then, of course, I think anybody in the agricultural industry is kind of facing an issue around labor, increasing labor, the increasing price of labor, difficulty, just sheer numbers in getting labor. And then with reforestation and restoration, there's of course this question of land access. So we may have a demand for reforestation on federal land or state land, but are we going to be granted access to actually implement a project on that?
And I think one of the key things with it too is the funding side of it, because these projects, like the photo being shown here, this entire project doesn't go up overnight. There's
Absolutely
a lot of money is invested in a project such as that. And as we all know, whether it's private or federal, money doesn't move super quickly. So it's one of those that even if we wanted to bump, like the number you keep talking about, the 25%, if we wanted to get that closer to 100, it's not a 1 or 2 year process. There's multiple, it's probably a decade and lots of funding that has never been available before to get us there. And then you would also run into the problem of having growers that are capable of taking over some of that extra canopy space and doing what we need to do to get up to that 100%. There's just kind of a lack of all aspects all around with that side.
Absolutely. And I will say too, with funding, a lot of the funding that's been kind of pushed into the reforestation and restoration space has been pushed into capacity building in terms of like technical knowledge, and then also pushed into the implementation portion. So paying to make sure that we're getting trees and plants in the ground. There hasn't been a ton of funding towards building nursery capacity in terms of putting up actual buildings, which obviously all of us in the nursery industry understand what a huge capital investment that is. And so my hope is that we start to see that change and we start to see a little bit more money coming into actually building that with the ability to build structures. So
yeah, I think
you got it taken care of.
Did you ever recall where the funding sources came from for the Montana and Washington projects?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't quite hear you. Your microphone's going out there, Paul.
It's very screechy, Paul. Are you asking where some of the funding came from for the Montana and Washington projects?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So there's two different types of funding on this side. So the photo being shown here, this is a privately funded operation up in Montana. So this one is all private money, but then we are also working on another project just 2 hours north of this project on Montana, which is completely government funded. So that is federally funded, coming from USDA grants, Forestry Service grants, and to be quite frank, the federally funded projects, those grants were received over a 5-year period to build something similar to what you see on this. So it wasn't the customer didn't win one grant, was able to build out something like this. They had to win multiple grants. I think it came out to a total of 17 grants over a 5-year period in order to be able to build something like this. So it just goes deeper and deeper. The Washington project's the same situation. It's USDA and Forestry Service grants that are being had. And then to go even further is some of those grants are awarded, and then from a change of administration side of things, some of those grants were taken away. So the scale of everything gets reduced. And it's one of those just never ending cycles of you have money and then all of a sudden the money's pooled, and it took you 5 years to receive all that money. And then once the money gets into your bank account, all of a sudden you have to be utilizing it within months or else it gets pulled. It's not an easy process. It's not for the kind-hearted. It is a very difficult process, and it's a lengthy one. Projects can take, like the one up in Montana took 5 years. We're moving on year 2 on the Washington project. They can take forever. And those, I think, as a lot of us would probably think, government-funded projects always typically go a little bit slower. That's the one positive side of the private side of our industry. But with it too, there's a lot less private funding going into this than there is government funding on some of it.
Absolutely. I will say that, from a business perspective, this is an interesting place to sit within the nursery industry because, you have private and government partners kind of working towards the same goal. And as it stands right now, there's so much demand for this material that I don't want to say that competition doesn't exist, but it's certainly not as competitive as a lot of other parts of the nursery industry. And so what's great is there's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of lessons learned that get shared across nurseries. For instance, my nursery partners pretty closely with the nursery pictured on this slide. And I'm very appreciative of that because at the end of the day, we're all working towards the same goal. So even if a federal nursery or a state nursery is able to tap into funding that private nurseries might not be able to, we still benefit from that in a roundabout way.
Awesome. And we do have another question in the chat. And it's a multi-part question. And Katelynn, I'll let you answer them all first, and then I'll kind of come back in and answer them later on, because I think we both will have a little bit different perspectives on it. So the first one is, where are students being taught the art of growing trees? Is this being done through the DOA or most new companies, employees from existing reforestation companies? And then how much of the growing process is happening inside the greenhouse, and at what point are those seedlings being moved outside? And then lastly, where can I get more info on this entire industry? So I'll let you go first and then kind of add my 2 cents here later on.
Yeah, so where are students being taught the art of growing trees is a great question. I think we have a lot of we're fortunate in the United States, we have a lot of leading, technical academic research institutions, especially here in the Western United States. So University of Idaho has a leading research nursery, as does New Mexico Highlands University, and the Colorado State University also has a nursery that's attached to its Forest Service, to the State Forest Service. So I would say that from a purely academic standpoint, those are the places that students are learning the art of growing trees. But any of us who are in production know that the most learning happens with boots on the ground. So I would argue that students or early career professionals in this industry are learning the most by going into these nurseries who are producing this type of material and asking questions and asking to be interns or for entry-level positions. We see a lot of growth there. We work a lot with young professionals and early career professionals. And I think that's where most of the knowledge is being shared. That said, we certainly could improve upon opportunities for these people. And, I would say it's pretty equal, like whether you are getting your hands dirty at a federal or state nursery versus a private nursery, I would say the opportunity for learning is similar. I think most folks in the native plant nursery understand that we have a need for new people. So I would say there's not really one better way to go or another. And then how much of the growing process is happening inside the greenhouse and when are those seedlings moved outside? Hard question, but I would say if we're thinking of a seedling that's on our property for 10 months, I would say they're in our greenhouse probably about 3 to 5 of those months, and then they're moved out to be hardened off for the remainder of that time. Usually we're trying to give them either a full summer season or a full winter season outside to really toughen them up.
And then I think also on where students are learning thing, and I hate to continue going back to this, but it goes back to funding as well. So I'm based in Colorado. All three of us are based in Colorado. We are all very familiar with the Colorado State University program and everything there. But even still, having more funding into universities like that to be able to build greenhouses like this so students can learn hands-on when they're in the program and everything like that. It goes back to the funding side of things. What projects are being built? Are universities able to build real world examples? And then from there, thankfully, Katelynn, you guys are close to Colorado State. I'm sure you guys are able to help out with that side. But if there's not a nursery, a reforestation nursery close to that university, where are students able to get that training and that hands-on experience? It's a really difficult thing because there's not a nursery for the reforestation side in every town. It just isn't the truth. So having that and just building out more and more would help with everything, but it's again kind of falls back upon the funding side of life.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a tricky one for sure. And I will say that in the 70s and 80s, we had the Conservation Corps, which was a federal program that helped to get young people into the field of conservation. And that was critical for a lot of the folks who are now, kind of retiring out of the field. That said, the state of California has tried to re-envision that for their state specifically and has seen great success for that. So that would be an awesome place to get more information. The state of California has really kind of rallied behind their need for reforestation. And then other places you can get more information, on where you can learn yourself is the federal, the U.S. Forest Service has a website. It's called RINGR, RNGR, and it's I forget what the acronym stands for exactly. I think it's Reforestation Nurseries and Genetic Resources, and they have manuals on manuals that kind of outline decades of experience in this industry, and it's all free for you to use. And you also can look at their directory and see what native plant nurseries exist in your area. And then the Nature Conservancy also has a reforestation hub. If you Google the Nature Conservancy Reforestation Hub, you'll be able to find a lot of resources on that website, including ways to quantify the need for reforestation in your region, state, or county in the U.S. So
awesome. And Greg, I do see your question coming up about the automation and the different growing systems. We will be getting to that here very shortly, so I'm going to continue forward here. And we kind of talked about this a little bit, Katelynn, on private sector versus federal agencies. We may have gotten a little bit ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah.
But and this kind of is a good photo as well to Sid's question earlier on being grown outdoors versus inside of the greenhouse. But what do you see by being a private nursery, working with the USDA, the Forestry Service, private entities and everything like that? Do you see a major difference between those situations?
I do. I think, when we developed the company, we developed it under a guiding principle that we knew we were going to have to navigate a lot of our partners or a lot of our clients own red tape within the systems that they live in and the systems that they are governed by. And so we wanted to make our private nursery as the least difficult to work with as possible. And I would say most of the private nurseries in this space follow kind of a similar mantra. And it's because if we're trying to collaborate with federal, state, or municipal entities, they're going to have their own suite of red tape, right? Whether it's their own bidding system, their own requirements on where seed is sourced, their own timelines for funding and implementation. And as a private nursery, you have to be very flexible to meet those demands. Otherwise, you could miss out on some really impactful projects, and not only in terms of your bottom line, but impactful in terms of what they could do for the restoration space and for ecosystems. So in terms of who we work with at OneCanopy, I would say the bulk of our customers are actually environmental nonprofits. So those are mostly like watershed groups. So thinking, a watershed group that focuses on a watershed within your locality, or even broader groups that focus on water quality for a state or as a whole, and then habitat groups. So some of those habitat groups are folks like the Mule Deer Foundation or the Wild Turkey Foundation, who have a vested interest in improving habitat for those animals. And those environmental nonprofits are mostly implementing projects on federal or state land. So kind of a way to navigate red tape. You work with the nonprofits who are a little bit easier to work with to get federal or state jobs done.
And then on that too, and this is something that I have seen in the West a lot, is the appreciation and new, I guess, love that people are having for planting natives in their own yard. So you are going to retail garden centers and you're seeing an entire section of natives and small trees that are being sold to residential owners, and they are placing those in their yards. Do you guys do anything with that, or are you guys focused on more of the wholesale side?
We initially were, I would still say we're more focused on the wholesale side, but we've started to expand working with other retail nurseries to get these products into people's front yards. I would say that most nurseries who are focused on reforestation or restoration are selling in bulk. For us, I think we have some of the smallest quantities that I know of, but we sell 25 of an individual species. There are reforestation nurseries out there that won't sell less than 10,000 plugs of an individual species. So we're pretty small compared to that, but still, if you're trying to, plant a ponderosa pine in your front yard in the city, you probably don't want 25 ponderosa pines. So how we're working through that is selling to other retail nurseries who can kind of sell the onesie twosie plants. And, we're seeing that market kind of blow up, especially as more municipalities and states implement legislation that's requiring less lawn or more natives planted in their urban landscapes. So,
And I think too, from that side, it's not only helping the restoration side on, because a lot of people will ask, like, how can I help with this? That is one way, but then it is also just the general knowledge of the everyday consumer knowing what a native is, how important natives are, and everything like that. Bringing that to a consumer side of things and keeping it just everybody's kind of aware of this now, and making it to where people have a passion for it and people start, pushing that, maybe get more funding on some of this side. And I think the wildfires are going to be a big thing too, because those aren't going to be replanted next year. It's just not as simple as that. And moving on to all of that and just doing general knowledge and education to everybody, I think, is a major factor in moving this whole industry forward.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many industry partners we've worked with. So like a state or federal entity who has come to us because they've heard about what we do through like their neighbor who planted a native plant garden. So every little bit of conversation around this helps.
Yep. And then we're a little bit late on time, so we're going to try and move a little bit forward, but doing bare root versus greenhouse grown containerized seedlings. So Katelynn, do you guys do anything bare root, or is everything you guys doing on the plug side where you're growing it inside of a container?
Yeah, so everything we do is containerized, and that's simply because of the market in which we work in. In the Rocky Mountain region, containerized seedlings tend to do better once they're outplanted, but it is from a nursery perspective, a higher cost to produce that seedling. And of course, we have to pass that on to the customer. For a long time, bare root, and in parts of the country where they receive more water than we do, bare root is still kind of the leading type of plant that's being planted in these restoration projects.
So on that, you're seeing more of a regional aspect
Mhm.
of bare root versus containerized more than what is successful. There's not one solution works for everything. It's kind of from a regional perspective.
Absolutely. And then I think it's just like a cost benefit analysis for you as the implementer. So if you've got labor, if I were going to, if I don't have the money to pay for containerized seedlings, but I have the money to pay for bare root seedlings, then maybe I'm just planting more of them and being a little bit more cautious and intentional with how I'm planting them to increase their survival. So it's really, up to whoever's doing the implementation. But by and large in the West, containerized seedlings are driving the market.
Awesome. Well, moving on to our next one here, and this is kind of going. I'll run through this one real quick, but this is kind of going off of Sid's question on what is the timeline of being grown in a climatized, climate-controlled greenhouse versus outdoor, and really focusing on this right photo over here. So you can see in the middle to the left of that green, what we would call a head house, that is a climate-controlled very high-tech, high-end greenhouse facility there. So that's where germination's happening. That is where the very first couple weeks post-germination, those plants are growing. We are trying to keep that climate as ideal as possible to get that plant to root, be healthy, and the whole 9 yards there before we're moving it out. And then if you look at the top of that photo, you can see a couple shade houses. So those are houses that still have polyfilm on them. We're putting shade on top of those. We could consider that almost like this intermediate stage where things are moving out there. We're still keeping temperatures a little bit higher out there. And then near the bottom of the photo, you can see these are hoop houses that have basically had the polyfilm completely taken off. So these are houses that are essentially being grown fully outdoors. We might have a shade cloth on top of it, but realistically, it is completely an outdoor environment. It's if it rains, those plants are getting rained on. And that is a big thing, I think, with natives too, that it doesn't always have to be the most complicated thing. They are a native plant. They are intended to grow in this environment. So you don't always have to grow them in high climate controlled greenhouses. Once you get them past that germination stage, you can move them into what I would consider very low tech greenhouses. And you can even see in this photo, there's not even a covering on it anymore. Like it is completely being grown outdoors. And then just moving on, like the other two photos, the top left one, that's in a hoop house, kind of like a shade house, what I was talking about in the top right of the right photo, kind of being seen in there. So those are some taller plants. We're being able to keep some heat in there. We're moving air with some of those exhaust fans. And then the bottom left photo, you can see we have an evaporative pad wall inside. We're doing much more climate control inside of that greenhouse. And those are for much, much younger plants. So moving on to the next one, the different greenhouse systems for tree production. So I think me and Paul will probably take this one on. And this is one of those that it all, again, kind of comes down to funding. There's 1,001 different systems we can put inside of a greenhouse, especially for the reforestation and restoration side. But on an everyday example, greenhouses are looking very similar to what you see over there on the right. We're doing roof fence with a twin wall polycarbonate. We are doing what we've seen a lot of success with is rolling benches. So we're not necessarily growing on the ground. We are doing rolling benches with an expanded metal top. You're able to get some airflow through the canopy of those plants by doing that. You can do underbench heat systems. There's a bunch of different ways we can do airflow inside. We're typically sticking with the horizontal airflow fan type of design, which you can see in that right photo. But from there, I guess even going a little bit broader on the structure types in the photos we were looking at earlier, we are doing much more engineered gutter connect style structures for the germination side. So what you see on the bottom left, that photo, that is of Katelynn's facility. So on that one, we don't have twin wall polycarbonate, we're doing polyfilm, but we are treating that whole zone as one large zone and doing all of your germination and all of your young plants out of there, focusing a lot more on the system side. So doing environmental controls, having sensors inside, being able to look at what's the humidity, what's the temperature in there, especially at night, not letting it get below freezing inside of there. And then different ways of ventilating, via roof vents. We can do exhaust fans, evaporative pad walls, which I was showing in the last photo. And then a big thing, and I have found from all the projects I have worked on, is this very much not only comes down to funding, but also grower preference, is when it comes to irrigation systems. Typically, we're always doing an overhead style of irrigation, but whether that is a sprinkler design or a boom design, I have found really comes down to grower preference. So, Katelynn, I know you have overhead sprinklers at your facility. The photo in the top left is a photo of a boom system that we are utilizing for this. Up in Montana, the other projects we're doing overhead, and then over in Washington, we're doing different types of boom systems. So, what have you, Katelynn, have you seen a big difference between watering accuracy on an overhead sprinkler system versus a boom style system?
Yeah, so for us, the decision factor, just so early in our development to choose between those two systems, we just went with the overhead system, mostly because in the conversations we've had about the boom system is just with anything mechanized, you have to have the tech knowledge on site to be able to troubleshoot something like this. At OneCanopy, we grow about 1 million seedlings a year with just 3 production staff. And so we don't always have the people we need to do a boom system. That said, there is, an analysis you could do about labor. We do have to hand water our edges, I think a little bit more than those with boom systems. So definitely a cost benefit analysis. And like you said, I think for the most part, I've met growers who have had boom systems and absolutely hated them. And then I've met growers who have them and will never go back. So just preference.
Yeah. And I think the boom technology too, 15 years ago, it was there, but it wasn't a reliable system. You would have one Mr. break, and then you would have an entire line that never got watered. The actual controls of the boom system themselves definitely were not to the point where they should have been. They were not watering uniformly. There was a lot of issues with them, and I think a lot of people have gotten a bad taste in their mouth because of that and have gone to the overhead sprinkler system. But I think as technology has developed more and more, they have become more reliable systems. But you are correct that the more technology you put into anything, the more fail points you have, and it's a tough situation. If you don't know how to work on your booms when it goes out, you're kind of out of luck, and then you're hand watering everything, and then the whole labor saving side of utilizing a boom is completely out the window. And then I think really on the automation side, I would say this is an industry that has not fully gotten into the automation side of things. I think when you guys are seeding and you guys are filling pots, there's some automation that can be had on that front. But do you guys use any automation in your facility at all, Katelynn?
Aside from the initial sowing of seeds, so we have a machine, we grow in air trays and LE pots. So we have a machine that helps us, to craft that paper container, place it into trays, and then seed each one of those cells. Aside from that, we don't really have, everything else is done by hand. So, and before we had that machine, we were doing most of it by hand. I will say from a sowing standpoint, I think most native plant nurseries have some sort of technology on that end, but it usually really simple stuff, right? Like not, we probably have one of the more advanced systems, but as far as downhill technology is concerned, the boom might be some of the more advanced technology in this space that people are utilizing, at least at scale. So,
and another thing I think too is that's becoming more and more familiar and common in the industry is a palletized bench instead of a rolling bench.
Yes.
While there is a lot of benefits of a rolling bench, such as being shown in these photos, palletized really can allow operational efficiencies to like you can maximize them a lot.
Yeah.
But as we've discussed 100 times, it all comes back to funding. Palletized benching is going to be a lot more expensive than rolling benches are. And it's one of those, if you don't have the capital, it's not even worth the conversation from that side to begin with.
And I think one of the considerations too is like most of us aren't building because of this capital constraint greenhouses from the bottom up. And so a lot of times we're purchasing existing structures. And we had a conversation very briefly in the beginning, I think with Paul, about what would palletized benching look like. And very quickly decided there's no way we could do it in this space. Rolling benches is where we wanted to go. And we're pretty pleased with that with our current overall setup.
Mm-hmm. All right. And Paul, is there anything you wanted to add to this before we move on to the next one?
I can touch on the palletized benching. You guys can hear me okay? Can you hear me okay?
It's very screechy. It is very, very screechy.
I'll get this close to the thing. Well, the palletized benching works better when you're running a lot of the same crop. So if you're running a bunch of different SKUs with different timing, you're going to end up having more challenges with the palletized benching than with a rolling bench. The other thing we see a little bit more of nowadays, gutter connects versus ground to grounds. That's usually an energy and labor cost saving element. And you're also able to have the shade system to those gutter connects.
Okay, awesome. I think when I mute there, it gets a little bit better. So we'll continue doing that. But moving on, just so we do have some time at the end to answer questions, is basically this is kind of the last slide before we finalize everything. But growing seedlings in a greenhouse. Katelynn, is there? I know this is something you're very familiar with. Do you want to talk? And we've kind of already talked a little bit about seed selection and stratification and everything. But is there anything else you wanted to add on this side before kind of finalizing things up?
No, I would just say, as far as propagation methods are concerned, earlier on, I said, most folks in the space are producing from seed. Cuttings are not uncommon. We focus mostly on hardwood cuttings. If we go the cutting route, you can go softwood cuttings, but there are certainly more considerations in terms of your growing environment if you go that direction. So have to make some modifications and buy some specific technology to be able to do the softwood cuttings. There's also a technical component included in that, but those are all things that folks in this industry use. And I would say even tissue culture is starting to take off a little bit more, but again, requires kind of a specific set of knowledge and technology to be able to implement.
And I think a big thing too, and this kind of goes back to the system side of what can be implemented and kind of looking down to the last two bullets here is the fertigation side and the light side of things. So on the fertigation side, I wouldn't say it's the most complex situation when it comes to fertigation. I feel like a lot of growers and nursery owners are using dosatrons, and if really maybe an H.E. Anderson, maybe a direct inject style situation there, but even still, I would consider that one of the higher end fertigations. Are you guys just using dosatrons at your facility?
Yeah, we just use a dosatron.
Yeah, so pretty simple fertigation. Obviously, are you guys checking pH and EC on each feed line, or is it one of those kind of set it and forget?
Yeah, it's for us, set it and forget. I wish we were a little bit more technical. That's certainly something we're aiming to be, but I think also speaks to the fact that native plants can be a lot less picky than other plants in the industry. So we are fortunate in that regard.
Yeah. And then from a light perspective, a lot of reforestation facilities, especially in the higher end climatized greenhouses, we are looking at doing LEDs and to add some supplemental light to the overall crop. And again, it kind of comes down, LEDs are not the cheapest option, especially in today's world. So while we've all seen the greenhouses where there's thousands of LEDs inside of it, I think when you would walk into a reforestation greenhouse, you would be quite amazed at the minimal number of lights that are going in there. It's very much from a smaller supplement site and basically just trying to do it. Do you guys do anything from like changing light systems and light like photo periods or anything like that? Is there anything you're doing?
We don't. We're pretty, again, rudimentary in that regard. yeah, we don't have any supplemental lighting. This year is the first year we even have used shade cloths for photo period manipulation. But other than that, not much. So
Okay. And so we've got 5 minutes, and I see a number 4 next to the question. So moving on to these, oh, one of them was saying Paul's mic was not working. CO2, what are the advantages? And this is a question from Sid. So how advantageous is CO2 in the plant growing process? To what levels can you see increased growth? And will constant CO2 enrichment be an advantage from propagation to moving it outside as much? Do you guys use any CO2 in your facility?
no, it was something that we considered early on, just from where our growers had come from. They had utilized a facility that also, or they had worked in a facility that utilized CO2. We haven't found that we need it. Again, I think, the great thing about native plants, if you're growing native plants in the region that those plants are native to, a lot of times you're already in the environment that they want to live in. And so we haven't had to add any CO2 to our greenhouse. I also hesitate to, to your question, Sid, about continuing that CO2 outside. I think from a germination perspective and in that germination greenhouse, I could see the benefit to CO2. But once those seedlings are moved outside of our germination greenhouse, we really want to start to get them used to a climate that they're going to have to live in for the rest of their life. And so every input, whether that be fertilizer or water or light or CO2 that we are giving to them, we want to make sure that we're not spoiling them too much. And so if we were to implement CO2 on our property, I think it would be just in the germination side of things, not all the way out into the outside greenhouses.
And another thing that kind of adds to that is even on the climatized greenhouses, typically they're mechanically exhausted or passively exhausted or ventilated. So it's one of those, you can add CO2 in there, but you're doing a constant exhaust and ventilation perspective. So you're really adding CO2 in there. And how long is it in there before you're actually ventilating that it's just going straight outside? So it's one of those, there's definitely could be, it's kind of a risk reward. There is potential reward to it all, but it's not one of those that you would see like in some other nursery sides of things.
Good question.
But yeah, great question. And then we kind of been answering questions as we go, but wanted really to thank everybody for coming today. If there's any more questions, we've got 3 more minutes. We'd be more than happy to answer them. But if anybody would like supplemental information, anybody has just general questions, these are our emails here. So that is Katelynn's at the bottom, mine and Paul's up above. And this is something I feel like all 3 of us are really passionate about. So we would all be more than happy to talk about it, whether it's about a new greenhouse, whether it's about just a general question on anything. I think we would all be very happy to answer any and all questions regarding this topic.
Yeah. Thank you guys very much for coming. We, like we said earlier, every conversation on this topic goes a long way. So thanks for your interest.
Awesome. Well, I will end it, but thank you guys so much for coming.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mark.